So as you know, this panel is about low wage, unemployment, inequality, and the fight to reduce that inequality. We have a really great panel here today. Starting on my left, we have Wiley Reimer, and he is a Hopkins hospital worker.
Yes.
He was recently on strike just a few weeks ago, and his union and Johns Hopkins Hospital are in negotiations right now. And if by next Friday they don't reach a contract, they're going back on strike. Next to him on his right, we have Sarah Benjamin. She is a member of the Union Leadership Committee at Unite Local 7. She works for Hudson News at BWI, which is a publicly owned airport that I'm sure many of us have been to. On my left, we have Frank Hammer. He's a retired General Motors employee, and he's a regular guest at The Real News. And so if you watch The Real News, then you'll be familiar with Frank. On my right, we have Carl Alexander. He is the John Dewey Professor of Sociology, Chair of Department of Sociology at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and he's just coming out with a new book, The Long Shadow. He studied how race, class, and poverty affects people's outcomes in this city of Baltimore. And on absolute right, we have Luis Laren, and he is a leadership organizer with United Workers, and he'll talk about what is being done today and what has been done in the past in Baltimore to organize low-wage people and how we can fight and win to help elevate these issues. So let me start with Wiley. So Wiley, briefly talk about why the workers at Johns Hopkins Hospital, we've all heard of Johns Hopkins. It's the most prestigious hospital in the world. It's the biggest employer in Baltimore City, multi-billion-dollar institution, and it hardly pays any money in taxes. That means we all subsidize this hospital. Talk about why you and the other workers in your union went on strike and are prepared to strike again.
Well, we went on strike and we're prepared to strike again because Hopkins is not paying a living wage. For example, in my case, I'm a father of 4. I'm on food stamps and medical assistance. I make $11.19 an hour. I've been at Hopkins for 2 years. Basically, with my paychecks is pay my rent. And it's a shame. Hopkins has a plantation mentality. And when I mean plantation mentality is about 93% of the workers that our union covers are African American. The other 7% is another race. And I believe if you take that number and you flip that number around, we wouldn't be sitting here having this discussion right now. Hopkins is the biggest employer in Baltimore City. They can spend billions of dollars on towers, but they don't want to take care of their people. We got single mothers at Hopkins who are in homeless shelters, not in homeless shelters, but they're living with family members. We have a lady on our bargaining committee who is in a homeless shelter, and she works at Johns Hopkins Hospital. If Hopkins would do the right thing and pay the workers a living wage or a fair wage, it would turn the corner for Baltimore City. And what I mean by turning the corner for Baltimore City, we had people talk about the violence and the drug dealing and the crime. You got the single mothers out there that are working. They're just making enough to pay the bills. So the children don't have the money to do the things that they want to do. So what do? They go out and make the money one way or another. If the companies would just pay the money, everything would be fine. And yes, we are prepared to go back out on strike again, and we'll keep going out on strike till Hopkins does the right thing.
So Sarah, I want to go to you next. So if I understand correctly, you helped just lead a one-day strike at Hudson News, at BWI. I know you belong to a union, but I know many of your colleagues that work at BWI are not unionized. So talk about the struggle at BWI and talk about why you're fighting for higher wages, better benefits, and how this impacts your life.
Okay, so for me, as a worker at Hudson specifically, we're fighting really for a fair contract right now. We've been without a contract for the last 8 months with an emphasis on livable wages, peace in the workplace, but also better benefits. BWI right now is a state-owned facility, and most other state-owned facilities here in Maryland, Baltimore, Maryland, are getting a livable wage, except for the cashiers and a lot of the entry-level, workers at BWI. And I think, like other panelists have said, that goes back into the mindset and kind of like what America and especially Baltimore City have seen the last 50, 60 years is just continuing on, where it's kind of like, well, we want to keep a certain minority in a position. I have a coworker, I'm not going to say her name, but she's experiencing homelessness right now. And she makes $9 an hour. She works full time. She doesn't have any children. She doesn't attend school. So she's not paying college bills, but yet she still cannot afford a home to stay. And a lot of the workers at BWI, a lot of the workers at Hudson are females, and there's a lot of ladies from Ethiopia. It's quite a few ladies from Pakistan, and they're supporting the whole families, brothers, sisters, they're sending money back, and a lot of them, they live together. Me personally, I have a daughter, a 5-year-old, and I have 3 roommates. I cannot afford to live on my own. Like he said, I receive food stamps, and I receive medical assistance, not necessarily because I want to, but because I have to, just to balance out, being able to pay my bills, being able to pay for my daughter to get into extracurricular activity. Because for me, that's important, to make sure my daughter learns how to swim and she gets involved in sports and she's not just going to school and coming home. So it's frustrating when, you see this airport and you see the customers, just looking at the type of customers that come through BWI. I've had customers drop $200 on headphones and books at Hudson Booksellers, and I'm like, I can't even, pull up my $300 for rent, this month, and here this lady is buying $300 worth of nothing. And it's a lot of that, and it's a lot of construction at BWI. But yeah, a lot of the workers, especially the entry-level workers, cashier, concession stand workers, we're not reaping none of that. I feel like the working class, we're the backbones of America, but yet we get the end of, we get the short end of the stick. And, especially I've seen with other co-workers at different companies at BWI, Samuel Adams just got shut down. And at BWI, it's not a lot of job security. The turnover rate is so big, and it seems since Air Mall came, which is like this third party that came into the airport, and before Air Mall came in, a lot of the concession stands, Silver Diner, the other fast food places, they was unionized. And basically, they took that out, and Air Mall put in a company, Host, I believe it's called, and basically they own or take care of all these little companies, and they had to say, okay, we have 10 stores, we could take 8 out, at any time, and the workers are not informed. They gave Samuel Adams workers 2 weeks notice. No back pay, no severance, nothing. Just, in 2 weeks you'll be out of a job. And even at Hudson being unionized, with Air Mall being there, is an opportunity that out of our 14 stores, that half of them could just be wiped out. And where do that leave me? I've only been there, Hudson, a year. So, we go by seniority. And if I've been there only a year and 7 of our stores get wiped out, it's a possibility that I might be the first to go. And then I'll have to go back to social services and get benefits. And it kind of goes back into, what a few others said, that, then I'll be in the same position. I'll still be, living with 3 roommates with my daughter. So it's definitely hard to kind of, when you can't even afford housing, sometimes those two things.
Sarah, so we're going to come back to that, because that all definitely ties together.
I get passionate. I apologize.
Oh, man.
So I wanted to bring in Luis into the conversation as well. Luis, you work with United Workers. It's not a union, but it's a community organization that works to support workers. One of their biggest fights, I know I was still in high school at that time, one of the biggest fights that United Workers did was help unionize the workers at Camden Yards. And so that is the Oriole, where the Orioles play, and that's a obviously publicly subsidized institution, as many sports teams are. $multi-$100 million sports team, their payroll is like $200 million, but they were paying their workers minimum wage. So talk about the work you do and how, for example, that fight at United at Camden Yards was able to result in a victory.
Sure. Well, yeah. It actually the workers at the Orioles Stadium, they were receiving less than the minimum wage. I was one of those day laborers that were working at the stadium at the time that the United Workers was organizing, and we pretty much sometimes make $4 per hour or less. And yes, at the Orioles Stadium, women was sexual harassed all the time. Workers were obligated to eat in the bathrooms because it is bad publicity. You know, looks bad if they are eating outside because the fans will look at them, as ridiculous as sound. So people were eating in bathrooms or in the room supply, you know, with all the other chemicals that you use to clean. So those were some of the conditions that we were confronting. United Workers start to organize as a response of the analysis of what is the problem in our society, and mainly the inequality. And when we talk about inequality, we are not just talking about the economic inequality, but actually the inequality in power, because at the end of the day, that's the problem. We know that it's not just that people don't have money, but that we don't have power, or that we have been told that we don't have power. We have been told that if we are poor people, we are dumb, we are stupid, and we don't have any reason to believe that we can change our conditions. And that's the way that the United Workers start to think and to develop leaders, and not just to organize to have a living wage. Because one of the things that we understand is by having a living wage, we are not ending exploitation. By having a living wage, we are not ending the horrible conditions that workers are confronting. And we are not changing inequality. And therefore, we are not changing our society. But what we think and believe is, and develop those leaders that have the analysis, that have the intelligence to know what is the problem. And remembering what Dr. King said about there's an edifice that is producing beggars. And yet we're still looking at that beggar as the problem, and not thinking that edifice needs to be restructured, needs to be redone, and need to get back to what we should be as society. And that's what United Workers' mentality is. Like, how do we fight against this situation that is corroding our democracy? How we fight against this 1% and politicians that are tied together one by one. And it's not just about if they know what is right or what is not right, but there is a system that is very well structured. And we cannot say that the system is not working, because the system is actually working perfectly for who was designed for. But it never was designed for us. And that's how United Workers think. That's how United Workers develop leaders. And our main idea is, like, how do we develop those workers to understand that it's not just about having a living wage. It's beyond that, because you have a living wage, and yet you still live in the same communities that always are getting budget cuts, the communities that always are in poverty, the communities that first receive all the bad things, and not the developers, right? We always see how developers are subsidized, as you were saying, the stadium receiving a lot of money, the Inner Harbor receiving a lot of money. The workers that are working at the Inner Harbor are not making a lot of money either. The average that the Inner Harbor workers are making is like $8, more or less. And you can say, well, that's above the minimum wage. It's not that bad. But try to survive when you receive $8 and you just work 20 hours. And if you can do that, yeah.
That actually transitions perfectly into Dr. Carl Alexander, because Dr.
Right.
Carl Alexander just completed and is publishing this remarkable study called The Long Shadow, and he's been profiled in The Sun, and he's gotten a fair deal of publicity about it, which I think is due, because for 25 years he followed the lives of 800 randomly selected Baltimore school children, starting in first grade. And so talk about how, and so we looked at what we're talking about, right? How your parents' income, how your neighborhood, how that affects your outcomes. And so talk about a little bit about your study, and talk about, one of the main topics is violence in our communities. Talk about what the impact is on incarceration. And also if you can talk about how the media can cover these issues better as well.
Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me on. And for those elevated expectations. I feel a bit out of my element here because I don't have a labor movement background. And I'm envious, I admire those of you on the panel who do. But I have spent a good bit of time trying to understand employment patterns in Baltimore, and especially employment patterns for young people in the non-college workforce. An earlier panel mentioned Bethlehem Steel, which during the World War II was the largest steel mill in the world with 35,000 employees. As all of us in the room here and many watching know, Beth Steel is no more. It's now being broken up and sold off for scrap metal. But there are interesting issues revolving around employment prospects at Beth Steel. It was often a family affair with parents, their children, uncles, aunts working at Beth Steel. And the workforce there was integrated, but African Americans were relegated to the low-wage, low-skill jobs. And that experience is 2 generations removed from the experiences of the young people who were covered in our project. They're now roughly age 33. The project stopped at age 28. But their grandparents, many of them, worked in Beth Steel and in other industries in and around Baltimore during the height of industrialization. And as we all know, that time is long gone, and Baltimore, along with many of the other Rust Belt cities and industrial centers of the East Coast, has been ravaged by deindustrialization. But there are still people working in that sector of the economy. The deindustrialization script plays out at the macro level, but on the ground, there's still construction sites around Baltimore. There's still ships coming into the harbor to be unloaded. There are construction projects being, road resurfacing projects and the like. What we found is in being able to compare the workplace experiences of working class white and African American young people in Baltimore, working class whites and low income whites are often invisible, at least in terms of the research agenda, and often invisible in public discourse. But in point of fact, there are working class whites in Baltimore and in every other city like Baltimore. What we find is that the working class white men in particular have a tremendous workplace advantage over African American men in accessing high pay, high skill, steady employment. And it is tied in with violence and with criminal misconduct in a sense. Incarceration. We find, well, I'll just briefly, there was mentioned that some of you may be familiar with an ACLU report that was released last year on marijuana arrests in major metropolitan areas throughout the country. And the racial disparity in marijuana arrests was most pronounced in Baltimore. I think it was like 9-to-1 African American arrests versus white, where the rates of marijuana usage and other drug usage are quite comparable by race. So African Americans are much more likely to be drawn into the criminal justice system through behaviors that are quite widespread throughout society. But African Americans are more likely to get drawn into the criminal justice system and to incur penalties by virtue of having a criminal record and arrest record. What we found was that low-wage employers in the non-college labor market are much more likely to ask about a criminal record and an arrest record of African American applicants than of white applicants. We also found that African American applicants were placed at a much greater disadvantage if they hadn't completed high school. So these are barriers to employment.
And that's even though the white applicants were more likely to use drugs.
White applicants in our group, in fact, the group that had the highest rate of self-reported marijuana and heavy drug use and binge drinking were well-to-do whites who rarely got in trouble because they were doing these kinds of things in the secluded, the comfortable environment of college campus, and they had parents who could shelter them from consequences. The second highest rates of self-reported use of all of those things were working class whites. African Americans have the lowest levels of drug use, heavy drug use, and experience of binge drinking. Arrest and conviction records were very high for African American men and for white men, but it was more of a barrier to employment for the African Americans than for whites. What we concluded, and I mentioned Beth Steel for a reason, is that these greater opportunities to access high-wage, steady employment in the blue-collar workforce, those opportunities were often made available through word-of-mouth hiring and the social network advantages that whites have in accessing that kind of employment over African Americans. If your father worked in the industry, if your uncle living across the street was an auto mechanic, if you had a good friend at the neighborhood bar who was a welder or an electrician or a plumber, that helps open doors to gain access to the employment in that sector. And that is the strongest, most vibrant sector of the post-industrial economy for people that don't have the benefit of a college degree. And so there is, in a very real sense, what we see in this project of ours, it's an account of white privilege, but of a particularly insidious kind, because it's not sustained through overt discriminatory practices or explicit barriers to employment. It's a matter of parents and relatives and friends trying to help kids. And you can't hardly fault a parent, a relative, or a friend for wanting to help a child that you care about. African American parents feel the same way as white parents, but they don't have the resources and the opportunities and the social networks to help open those doors. And so it's all tied together with blocked opportunities in higher education, and then the kind of insidious penalties that are weighed disproportionately on the employment opportunities of African American men when they happen to make a misstep along the way, like getting involved with drug use or having criminal justice involvement. They really do pay a much more severe penalty for those kinds of missteps and transgressions than do African American men of quite comparable background and quite similar experience.
Thank you. And so, as you described the deindustrialized landscape, I think all of our minds probably went to Detroit, and that's actually where our next guest is from, Frank Hammer, a longtime GM employee and union activist. And so one thing we're not afraid to do at The Real News is be critical of anybody. We will always be critical of people who deserve criticism. And one thing Frank is not afraid to do is be critical of the union movement. And obviously we know the union movement's in decline around the country and around the world. But Frank, talk about your view of the role unions play in society today and across the world and across the country, and what The Real News can do to help promote unions that are fighting for their workers and for workers that are fighting for their unions as well.
Well, first of all, I'm very honored that I'm among all these Baltimoreans. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
You know, and being a Detroiter, so thank you very much. A shout out from Detroit, and I can tell you that many of the issues, of course, are very much in common with what we were experiencing in Detroit. And I want to sort of get around to the question, but I want to talk a little bit about Detroit and the world. A couple of years ago, there was a Super Bowl ad with M&M advertising Chryslers. And if you recall, it said something about imported from Detroit. And this was, in some instances, taken by Detroiters as a matter of pride, that isn't this great? Cars are being imported from Detroit. The slogan sent a chill down my spine, because there's another side to that question, and that is, what is it about Detroit that now we're importing cars from Detroit? And I think that the answer goes to the whole question, I think that was raised by a sister in the audience earlier, and that is the concept of third world. And that in fact, Detroit, Baltimore, so many other urban centers have joined the third world. And I think the important thing about that is to say, well, if that's the case, then we also have to identify what is the enemy? Where is this coming from? And I think if we would be remiss if tonight we didn't say that imperialism is our common foe, and whereas many of us in the United States of America thought that we had the privileged side of imperialism, right? Because our corporations could go in the third world and engage in super exploitation, and we would be in some ways beneficiaries of that, we're seeing that there's another side to this coin and another side to the sword, namely, third world is visiting us. That which we thought was there is now here. A couple of years ago, every year when we have the International Auto Show in Detroit, you'll see a bunch of auto workers out there expressing our irritation about the wealthy making additional bucks off of our backs. And there was one worker that showed up that was a UAW member that came up with a sign of his own, it was handwritten, and said, I am not a foreign auto worker. That's what he said on his sign. And I think that the answer, of course, is no, 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 no. We're all foreign auto workers. And I think the more that we understand that, and I think that one of the roles in talking about the media and talking about the real news is that the real news helps us make those connections between what's in fact going on in third world countries and what has visited us in our cities here in the United States. I had an opportunity to visit Colombia last summer. If any of you have seen some of the clips that we've done in the real news in regards to some GM workers in Colombia, which is why it took me to Bogota. One of the most striking things that I saw in Bogota, in Colombia, is what is called the informal economy. At every intersection, and this is a city of 8 million, at every intersection, my goodness, there were frantic vendors going amongst the cars, selling CDs, selling candy, selling this, selling that. They have a whole method that you put the CD in your hands. They'll come back in a minute expecting either money or the CD back. There were jugglers on the intersections asking for money because they entertain you while you were stopped in traffic. So I come back to Detroit, and I happened to attend a forum. We were having a mayoral election. I attended one of the forums where the current mayor was making a pitch. And one of the first questions from the audience was something about what kind of rules are you going to make for street vendors? And I thought, bingo, informal economy that we can witness in these other cities is going to visit us here because that's what imperialism has in store for our cities, is the informal economy. And here was somebody asking about, let's get the rules straight so I don't get kicked off the sidewalk because I've got to make a living somehow, right? So I'm going to give you a few more bits and I'll get back to the question of the unions. Recently we held a demonstration. I got a minute, okay. I like to talk a lot. We held a demonstration in front of the General Motors headquarters, and it was a demonstration not only about the GM workers in Colombia, but we had also connected with the GM recall survivors, because you've heard a lot in the news in regards to GM's callous disregard for human life with regard to customers who buy their cars. And coming back to the media, overwhelmingly, the media went to the story about the recall survivors, and the media did not want to have anything to do with the story about Colombia. And it's systematic, except for a few places, it is systematic that they want to keep and perpetrate this wall between those of us and keep us in a parochial sort of state of mind, rather than expanding our horizons and saying, oh my God, the workers in Colombia have a lot to say to us from what they're experiencing at the hands of a company that maintains a non-union plant with very dangerous working conditions in a city very far away. But these are brothers and sisters, and they're going to try to keep us apart. And the real news plays a very important role in trying to bring us together in a global movement, which is what we need. So to come back to the unions. The unions, unfortunately, I'll give a little story and then as a way of illustration. I was involved in negotiations in General Motors in 2003, and I was in a subcommittee about outsourcing. And at one point, one of the reps from the UAW said, we're really, really unhappy about you outsourcing so much work to Mexico. And the GM suit responded and said, well, you know, you have to keep in mind that when we do that, that's basically what enables us to give you your extra benefits and pay here in the States. And the room got quiet. And we went on to other business, right? And I think that's the crux of the matter in terms of what kind of role the unions have played in this question of imperialism and the third world and us.
Okay, so I think we have. Yep. So looks like we're out of time for this discussion.